I knew something was dead wrong the moment I stepped into the office that Tuesday morning. My calendar, which usually looked like a colorful grid of back-to-back technical meetings, database maintenance windows, and architecture syncs, had been completely wiped clean. There were no pings, no alerts, no reminders, just a single block of time sitting at 9 o'clock in the morning. It was simply labeled as a quick catch-up with the Chief of Human Resources, Brenda, with our new Chief Executive Officer, Victoria Thorne, invited as optional. But in my 30 years in the tech business, I have learned one thing. When a calendar invite says catch-up and human resources is on the list, it is not a casual chat. It is a corporate execution wrapped in polite packaging. I walked down the long hallway of Aerotech Systems, the company I had spent 12 years building from the ground up. I still remember the early days in 2014, when we operated out of a cramped office space with water stains on the ceiling tiles and a shared microwave that smelled like burnt popcorn. I was the one who pushed the very first line of code to the production server at 3 o'clock in the morning, my eyes bloodshot, my hair greasy, and my laptop battery hovering at 4%. Back then, there was no venture capital funding, no flashy marketing team, and no fancy offices. We only had raw determination, bad coffee, and a database architecture that scaled faster than we could hire engineers. They used to call me the anchor of the company, Steve, the silent engine. Steve, the guy who never missed a deadline. Steve, the co-founder who was too valuable to ever lose. But in the corporate jungle, too valuable quickly becomes too expensive once the founder decides to hand the keys to his children. Donald Thorne, our original founder, had retired 3 years ago. In his place, his daughter Victoria had taken the reins. She was 34 years old, had a degree from a prestigious business school, and had never written a single line of software in her life. But she had very strong opinions about user experience, product flow, and team vibe. Suddenly, meetings were not about technical feasibility or system latency. They were about alignment, synergy, and modern culture. Over the last 2 quarters, I noticed my invitations to the leadership syncs were slowly disappearing. When I asked about it, Victoria would smile and say she wanted to streamline the communication lines. It did not take a genius to see the writing on the wall. The old guard was being replaced by younger, cheaper talent who spent more uptime updating their professional networking profiles than fixing memory leaks. When I opened the glass door of the conference room at 9 o'clock, I was not surprised to see Brenda already sitting there with a thick manila envelope placed on the table. Victoria Thorne was standing by the window, looking out over the city skyline, holding an expensive green tea. She did not even look at me when I sat down. Brenda cleared her throat and started speaking in that rehearsed, soft tone that human resources professionals use when they are about to fire you. She talked about team feedback, evolutionary changes, and culture alignment. She said they had noticed a certain resistance on my part to embracing their new agile methodologies and collaborative structures. It was a classic corporate spin. The truth was simpler. I had refused to sign off on a rush software release that had massive security vulnerabilities, and I had publicly pointed out that Victoria's new vice president of product had no idea how our database replication worked. In their minds, I was an obstacle, a relic of the past who did not fit the fresh vibe they wanted to project to investors. Brenda slid the manila envelope across the polished wood table. "This is your formal exit package," she said. "Your termination is effective immediately." I did not yell. I did not complain. I did not ask for a second chance. I looked at the envelope, then looked Victoria square in the eye. She looked back at me with a smug, victorious grin. She thought she had finally cleared the path. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my security badge, and placed it gently on the table. Then, I reached into my bag and pulled out a slim, unmarked black folder. I laid it right next to my badge. "Pack your awards," Victoria said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "We truly appreciate your past contributions, Steve, but we need to move forward." I stood up, picked up the manila envelope, and walked out of the conference room. I did not make a scene. I walked past the row of desks where the younger engineers were working, pretending not to notice that their co-founder was leaving for the last time. Justin, our lead infrastructure guy, looked up from his monitor and mouthed, "What happened?" I just gave him a short nod and kept walking. Back at my desk, I packed my personal things. 2 glass trophies for Architect of the Year, a framed picture of the founding team from 2014, and my favorite notebook. I left the company-branded mug. I walked out of the building into the cool morning air, knowing exactly what was in the black folder I had left on Victoria's desk. It was a copy of our original shareholder agreement from 2014, and tucked away on page 73 was a clause she had never bothered to read. The news of my departure hit the company's Slack channels like a match, dropped into a pool of gasoline. By noon, my phone was buzzing constantly with private messages from former colleagues, junior developers, and managers asking if the rumors were true. The general channel had been locked down, but the private direct messages were frantic. The younger engineers were confused, while the older staff members were furious. Steve Vance was the history of Aerotech Systems. I knew every server configuration, every database password, and every quirk in our routing tables. Removing me was like removing the foundation of a house and expecting the roof to stay up. Victoria Thorne, however, was determined to control the narrative. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, she called an unscheduled, all-hands meeting. I watched the recording later, forwarded to me by an engineer who had recorded it on his personal phone. Victoria stood in front of a neutral background, wearing a sharp business suit, looking relaxed and confident. She talked about exciting new chapters, strategic transitions, and scaling our velocity. She thanked me for my past efforts, but stated that to reach the next level of market leadership, the company needed a technical director who was fully aligned with their forward-looking vision. She never used the word fired, but she made it clear that I was dead weight that had to be cut loose to improve their speed. I sat in the front seat of my older sedan in the parking lot of a local diner, watching the video on my laptop. The diner was a quiet place that smelled of fried grease and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the sleek glass offices I had just left. Outside, a slow, steady rain began to beat on the windshield, creating a quiet barrier between me and the busy world. I did not feel angry. I felt a cold, analytical focus. I had spent 12 years working 60 hours a week, putting my personal life on hold to build this company. My equity had been diluted in every funding round, but I had always kept one document close to my chest. I opened my laptop's local drive and clicked on the file named Article 7. Back in 2014, when Donald Thorne and I were drafting the original incorporation papers, our lawyers were young and inexperienced. Donald was a brilliant engineer, but he hated legal details, so he left the contract writing to me. I insisted on adding a protective clause. It was designed to prevent a situation where the founding engineer could be pushed out of his own company by greedy partners. Article 7 stated that the founding chief technical officer, defined explicitly as Steve Vance, could not be involuntarily terminated without the unanimous written consent of all registered investors in the company. Not just a majority vote of the board, but every single investor who held shares. The clause went on to outline the penalty for violating this rule. If the founding chief technical officer was terminated without unanimous consent, all intellectual property rights to the core system architecture, including the database engine, the proprietary routing protocols, and the custom APIs, would immediately revert back to the officer. In simple terms, if they fired me without asking the investors, the software that ran the entire platform would legally belong to me, and any continued use of that software by Aerotech Systems would constitute a direct violation of federal copyright law. I clicked Compose on my email client and drafted a message to my attorney, Gavin Boyd. Gavin was a veteran corporate lawyer who had spent 30 years defending engineers in intellectual property disputes. I attached a copy of the original shareholder agreement, my signed termination letter, and the video recording of Victoria's all-hands meeting. I wrote a single line in the body. Victoria just fired me unilaterally without a board vote or investor consent. Please initiate the reversion process under Article 7. I hit send. Then I closed my laptop and looked out the window at the gray clouds gathering over the city. I knew Victoria had already initiated negotiations for a major corporate transaction. She was trying to sell Aerotech Systems to a massive digital conglomerate called Villoc Technologies. The rumored price was $220 million. The acquisition was supposed to be finalized within the next 30 days. It was going to be her crowning achievement, the deal that proved she was a business visionary. But she had just built her entire deal on a foundation of stolen code. My phone rang 10 minutes later. It was Gavin Boyd. His voice was calm, but I could hear the sharp edge of professional satisfaction. "Steve," he said, "I have reviewed the documents. This is a clean breach. She did not get investor consent because she wanted to keep the firing quiet until the deal was done. She has no idea what she has just triggered." "How do we proceed?" I asked. "We say nothing to them," Gavin replied. "We file the formal notice of copyright reversion with the Federal Registry, and we prepare the cease and desist letter under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106. We will wait until Veloc Technologies begins their deep due diligence. When their lawyers look at the intellectual property chain, they will find a massive black hole where their asset ownership should be. Let them walk right into the trap." For the next 2 weeks, I remained completely silent. I did not post anything on my professional networking profiles. I did not reply to the emails from our board members, and I did not reach out to any of the junior engineers who were trying to contact me. I spent my days in my garage, working on the engine of my vintage truck, letting the silence do the work. In the corporate world, when a fired founder goes completely quiet, it makes the executives nervous. They expect a lawsuit, a public rant, or a competitor hire. But when you give them nothing, they start to worry that you are planning something far worse. Victoria Thorne was busy celebrating. The tech news outlets had just published leaks about the upcoming acquisition. Aerotech Systems was about to be acquired by Veloc Technologies for $220 million. Victoria was quoted in the articles talking about how her strategic leadership had positioned the company for this massive exit. She was hosting dinner parties for the executives and planning her transition to a senior role at Veloc. But behind the scenes, the due diligence process had begun. Veloc Technologies was a public company, which meant their legal team had to verify every single asset, patent, and contract before they could transfer the funds. They sent a team of high-priced lawyers, led by senior counsel Laura Miller, to review our files. Laura was a sharp clinical attorney who had overseen dozens of acquisitions. She did not care about corporate vibes or visionary presentations. She only cared about clean title and risk mitigation. She was a professional who spent her days looking for hidden liabilities, and she was very good at her job. While Laura Miller was combing through the legal documents, the engineering team at Aerotech was beginning to unravel. Without me there to manage the database replication, the systems were starting to experience latency spikes. Justin, our infrastructure lead, was working 80 hours a week trying to patch the holes, but he did not have access to the core encryption keys. I had stored those in a secure vault that required my personal hardware token to access. The system was designed to lock down if a major administrator was removed without a proper transition protocol. This was a safety measure I had built years ago to prevent unauthorized access, and it was now working exactly as intended. The database was slow, the client portals were freezing, and the customer support queue was growing longer every day. Victoria was screaming at the team to fix the issues, but without the master keys, they were helpless. Brenda from Human Resources tried to call the engineering team to resolve the security lockdowns. But the developers could only repeat that the database security vault was completely locked. In the second week of the audit, a junior analyst at Veloc named Nisha Gupta was running an automated compliance scan on our internal version control systems. She was looking for open-source code violations and proprietary licenses. During her search, she stumbled upon a legacy repository labeled Core Architecture version 1. It was the backbone of our entire data routing engine. The code had not been modified in years, but it was still the central pipeline for all client data. Nisha noticed that the repository had a metadata tag that was different from the newer codebases. The author was listed as Steve Vance, and next to his name was a legal restriction tag, referencing the 2014 shareholder agreement. Curiously, she opened the reference document in the company's shared drive. When she reached page 73, she read Article 7. She was not a lawyer, But she knew enough to realize that if the author listed in the code had been terminated, there had to be a corresponding investor consent form in the repository. She checked the compliance folder. It was empty. There was no board resolution, no investor signatures, and no waiver. Nisha Gupta flagged the file and sent it to her manager, who immediately forwarded it to Laura Miller. Within an hour, the mood in the acquisition war room changed from celebratory to freezing cold. Laura Miller read the clause twice, her face growing pale as she realized the serious consequences of this discovery. If the founding technical officer had been fired without investor consent, Veloct was about to purchase a company that did not actually own its own software. She immediately sent an urgent, confidential request to Victoria Thorne's office. Subject: Urgent Intellectual Property Clarification. The email asked for a single document, the signed investor consent form for the termination of Steve Vance, pursuant to Article 7 of the founding charter. When Victoria received the email, she did not panic. She assumed it was a minor administrative detail that her legal team could resolve with a quick phone call. She told Brenda to find the document. But Brenda could not find it because it did not exist. Victoria had fired me in a fit of administrative arrogance, believing that as the chief executive officer, she had the absolute authority to remove anyone she wanted. She had never checked the original agreement, and her internal counsel had been too intimidated by her to ask questions. The cracks in the deal began to spread quickly. When Victoria Thorne's legal team tried to stall, sending back a generic response about updated bylaws and subsequent funding rounds, Laura Miller was not satisfied. She knew that a subsequent round of funding could modify the cap table, but it could not retroactively void a protective founder clause unless the founder had signed a specific waiver. And I had never signed anything. Laura Miller forwarded the thread to the lead investor's counsel, Howard Albright. Howard was a senior partner at a major corporate firm in Chicago. He had represented the majority venture capital fund that had invested $15 million in Aerotech during our Series B round. Howard was not a friend of mine, but he was a friend of his client's money. When he saw the request and realized that Victoria had terminated the founding technical officer unilaterally, his blood ran cold. He knew the risk immediately. Under federal law, specifically Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106, the copyright owner has the exclusive right to authorize the reproduction and distribution of their work. If the IP had reverted to Steve Vance, Aerotech was currently operating an illegal copy of the system, and Veloct could be sued for millions if they proceeded with the acquisition. Howard Albright immediately called for an emergency board meeting. He did not ask for Victoria's permission. He used his authority as the representative of the majority shareholders to lock in the time. Monday afternoon at 4 o'clock, while the board was scrambling, I met with my lawyer, Gavin Boyd, in his office. We sat at a round conference table covered in printed spreadsheets and legal citations. Gavin was a veteran who had seen every corporate trick in the book. He explained that by filing the copyright reversion, we had essentially placed a legal padlock on the company's server code. If they continued to run the platform, they were committing copyright infringement on a massive scale. Under Title 17, we could seek statutory damages of up to $150,000 per willful infringement, and more importantly, we could ask a federal judge for an immediate injunction. An injunction would force them to shut down their servers, effectively killing the business overnight. Gavin explained that in his 30 years of legal practice, he had rarely seen such a clear-cut case of corporate negligence. Gavin had already drafted the formal cease and desist letter. He had also contacted Clara Jenkins, an investigative journalist who covered corporate governance failures in the tech sector. Clara was known for her brutal, factual articles that exposed how startup founders were pushed out by venture capitalists. She was not a writer who looked for gossip. She looked for documents, signatures, and filing errors. I did not want a sensational story, but I wanted the board to know that if they tried to sweep this under the rug, the entire industry would read about it on the front page the next morning. I gave Clara Jenkins the basic facts: the date of my termination, the text of Article 7, the lack of board or investor consent, and the federal copyright citations under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106. I did not add any emotional commentary. I did not call Victoria names. I let the cold, hard timeline speak for itself. Clara thanked me, took the documents, and began calling the board members for comment. Her phone calls sent shockwaves through the board. They realized that this was not just an internal dispute. It was about to become a public disaster. The impact was immediate. By Monday morning, a confidential legal memorandum drafted by Howard Albright had been leaked to the major investors. The memo outlined the extreme liability the company faced. It stated that because of the unauthorized termination of Steve Vance, the core technology of Aerotech Systems was subject to a hostile IP reversion, creating a massive compliance breach under the Federal Technology Assets Act. The memo concluded that the $220 million acquisition could not proceed until this issue was resolved, as Veloct would face immediate federal injunctions. A copy of this memo found its way onto a private chat group used by venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. Within hours, the rumors were everywhere, spreading through online forums, private chat rooms, and industry newsletters. The deal was in jeopardy, the investors were panicking, and the reason was Victoria Thorn's administrative negligence. Everyone was talking about how she had managed to destroy a $220 million transaction in a single afternoon. I received a text message from Victoria at 2 o'clock that afternoon. It was the first time she had reached out to me since the day she told me to pack my awards. The message read, "Steve, we need to talk. There has been a misunderstanding regarding your exit package. Let's meet for lunch tomorrow to resolve this." I did not reply. I showed the message to Gavin, who laughed. "She has realized the rope is around her neck," Gavin said. "But she still thinks she can negotiate her way out of it with a lunch and a slightly larger severance check. She does not understand that she is no longer holding the cards. You are." The boardroom on Monday afternoon was completely silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the soft rustle of paper. As Howard Albright distributed copies of the original 2014 shareholder agreement. The atmosphere was heavy, smelling of expensive cologne, old paper, and panic. Victoria Thorn sat at the head of the table, her face tense, her fingers tightly gripping a pen. Her chief operating officer sat next to her, looking down at his notepad, refusing to make eye contact. The other board members, including Walter, our oldest director, sat in silence, waiting for the storm to break. Howard Albright did not waste time with pleasantries. He opened his binder to page 73, pointed at the highlighted text, and read Article 7 aloud. His voice was calm, clinical, and completely devoid of emotion. When he finished, he looked up and stared directly at Victoria. "Did you obtain the written, unanimous consent of the registered investors before issuing the termination letter to Steve Vance on the 12th of last month?" Howard asked. Victoria cleared her throat. "We conducted an internal review," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Steve's role had become largely ceremonial. He was resisting our new operational methodologies, and we needed to make a change to ensure our velocity. The legal counsel we consulted at the time indicated that subsequent amendments to the cap table had superseded the original founder protections." "Which counsel?" Howard asked, his eyes narrowing. "Show me the written legal opinion. Show me the amendment that explicitly nullified Article 7. Victoria did not answer. She looked at her chief operating officer, who remained silent. She looked at Brenda, who looked at the ceiling. There was no written opinion. She had acted on a verbal guess, confident that she could override any contract with her executive authority. "The legal opinion you received was wrong," Howard said. "And because of that error, you have triggered a hostile reversion of the core intellectual property. Under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106, Steve Vance is now the sole legal owner of the routing database and the API structures. Aerotech is currently using his proprietary code without a license. That is a federal copyright violation. And Veloct Technologies has officially halted the acquisition due to this title defect." Victoria's face turned completely white. She looked around the room, searching for support. Walter, the oldest board member, finally spoke. You risked a $220 million acquisition to settle a personal grievance with a co-founder? He asked, his voice filled with quiet disgust. He was a man who valued stability and protocol, and he had no patience for reckless ego. He had spent his entire career in conservative manufacturing sectors, where contracts were treated like sacred texts, and he was absolutely appalled by Victoria's casual disregard for governance. "We can settle with him," Victoria hissed. "We can offer him a larger share of the acquisition pool. 5 million, 10 million, whatever it takes to sign the release. He does not want your money, Victoria," Howard said, pulling a letter from his briefcase. "This is a formal proposal from Gavin Boyd, Steve's attorney. He is willing to license the intellectual property back to Aerotech, allowing the Veloct acquisition to proceed, but his terms are non-negotiable. First, the company must pay him 3 times his original equity value, totaling $24 million. Second, the board must immediately remove Victoria Thorne from her position as Chief Executive Officer for material breach of fiduciary duty." Victoria stood up, her chair screeching against the hardwood floor. "This is my company," she shouted. "My father built this place. You cannot force me out." "Your father built this place with Steve," Walter said gently. "You just tried to steal it from him. The investors hold the majority votes, Victoria. We have a fiduciary duty to protect the shareholders. And right now, you are the single biggest liability on the balance sheet. The vote was unanimous." Victoria Thorne was placed on administrative leave immediately, with her formal termination as chief executive officers scheduled for the following morning. The board appointed an interim director to oversee the transition. The acquisition by Veloct Technologies was finalized 3 weeks later, under the restructured terms. I signed the licensing agreement, allowing them to use the database code, and received my $24 million payout. Victoria was escorted out of the building by 2 security guards, carrying her belongings in a cardboard box. She did not get a press release, a farewell party, or a transition bonus. She had tried to play a game of corporate power, but she had forgotten that a company's true value lies in its engineering, not its administrative titles. Now I sit on the deck of my home, looking out over the quiet lake, sipping my morning coffee. Aerotech is under new management, the systems are running smoothly, and the younger engineers are finally getting the resources they require. I spent 12 years building the backbone of that company, believing that hard work was enough. I was wrong. In the corporate world, you must always protect your foundation. Documentation is your only true shield, and when they tell you that you are easily replaced, do not argue. Just let the clauses do the talking.